Welcome to 5 Minutes of Faith. I'm Apostle Trevor Banks. Glad you've joined us today. Have a word I trust will encourage your heart, will give you strength in this time of coronavirus, and will give you victory in your mind and in your spirit. I want to go right to the scriptures in Numbers chapter 13. We have a portion of scripture referencing the time that God allowed spies to go into the promised land to spy out the promised land. Of those 12 spies, 2 of them were Joshua and Caleb. And there were 10 chosen from the other tribes of Israel. And from there, we want to springboard into this lesson I want to share with you. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 27 through 29, the scripture reads, "And they told him and said, We came unto the land whither you sent us, and surely it flows with milk and honey. And this is the fruit of it." Okay. "Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and Amorites dwell in the mountains. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan." Okay, now as we read in that portion of scripture, we'll find that there was a conflict between the report that Joshua and Caleb brought back versus the 10 spies from the other 10 tribes of Israel. Now, I want to point something out. In this hour, there's so much conflict in the world, so much polarizing, even in the church. So I wanted to point this out. Conflict will arise in this hour among men between those who are led by their senses versus those that are not governed by their senses. Let me say that again. There will be conflict in these last days, in this last hour of the church as we know it before the return of Jesus. There will be conflict on every level between those that are governed by their senses versus those that are not governed by their senses. I want to point out in this 5 minutes of faith, the spies that came back, in one hand, they had the fruit of the land. They were carrying a manifestation of what God had promised them. The grapes or pomegranate, whatever fruit they were carrying in and said, "This is the fruit of the land." It's just like God said. But on the other hand, they said, "But there we saw, with our own eyes, we saw giants." So what they were allowing was what they saw or what they sensed to override what God had given them as a promise. One of the things that Jesus told his disciples in Matthew chapter 24, when they asked what will be a sign of the end, the first thing that Jesus referenced was, "Let no man deceive you." There are so many frequencies, so many voices that are filling the airwaves, filling the atmosphere. One would be troubled on what to believe. But let me say to you, let no man deceive you. Let me go as far as to say, even don't allow your senses to deceive you. God speaks to our spirit man. God speaks through us through covenant and through the way of promises. It's interesting, again, they were carrying the promise, but they were governed by what they saw. The Bible tells us that the just shall live by faith. The promise they were carrying, the fruit, was just the earnest. It was the seed of what God had promised them. What they saw flooded their mind and their soul with fear, and fear began to govern them. So I want to say this again. Conflict will arise against or among men who are led by their senses versus those who are not led by their senses. So let's exercise our senses to discern what is of God and what is not of God. Till we meet again, remember, you don't need a whole lot of faith. Exercise what you have and watch how God will bless you. God bless you.